And what were your impressions that you'd gained from this, as well, presumably you had a look at JIC, about the overall state of Iraqi WMD?
Well, I was in no doubt at all from the material that I read that they had those capabilities. They had both chemical and biological capabilities.
And that the nuclear question was some distance off.
Yeah, there was a note really to the effect, going back to our earlier discussions this morning, that containment had prevented them from securing fissile material, but that they had pursued to quite an extent the technology required to do everything else, so that they were working hard on missiles, on those capabilities for delivery. They lacked access to fissile materials, but the point was made, and I think I repeated this morning, that if they could secure fissile material, then they would be able to move relatively quickly towards securing a nuclear weapon.
That's a very big if.
Oh yes, of course. No, I mean, and I conceded that this morning. I said that containment had been successful in that respect.
And when the question of the dossier came up, were you aware of this process? Did you take much interest in it?
I mean, I was certainly aware that there was going to be a dossier, and I was also aware that DIS would be consulted in the preparation of that dossier, yes.
And were you aware that there were some concerns within DIS about some of the language that was used in the dossier?
I wasn't aware of the detailed points until I think the Butler inquiry. I wasn't aware of the detailed drafting points that were made. I did at the time of Butler see the points, and obviously I understood the points that were being made at that time.
But this didn't percolate up to you as Secretary of Defence?
What I did see was a letter from the policy director on the 20th of September in 2002. He said, CDI's staff have been closely associated with the preparation of the detail of the dossier. I understand they are content from a professional DIS point of view with the judgments it contains. So I was given specific advice that the DIS was content with the dossier.
Okay, but and as we know from Hutton and Butler, that was the level at which these issues, it was decided in DIS not to take it further, the concern, so you weren't aware. When the document was published, obviously one of the issues was this 45 minutes question. Were you aware that a rather misleading impression had somehow got out there that this was related not just to munitions for battlefield use, but to longer-range missiles?
First of all, when I saw the draft, the only thing in the draft that, surprise is perhaps too strong a word, but the only thing in the draft that I had not seen before in terms of my familiarity with the intelligence was this 45-minute claim. I think, I can put it this way, my experience of dealing with intelligence over many years was that if you saw something new and different, I would ask about it. And I asked about what that meant. And I think I haven't been able to find it in any record, but almost certainly because of the way it happened. I asked my private office, and they got someone from the department, I think from DIS, but I can't be sure about that, to come and explain what that meant. And I had a kind of impromptu meeting in my office to really go through what was meant by a 45-minute claim. And the explanation was fairly straightforward, that Saddam had guns that could fire shells containing chemical weapons. He had done that against Iran and could do so again, and that 45 minutes was actually quite a long time for him to be able to order that these shells could be loaded into guns and fired. So that part of it was explained to me, and frankly, it seemed fairly straightforward. I didn't think much more of it. I know that thereafter, there was an issue about some newspaper reports. As it turned out, I had not seen those newspaper reports. I didn't actually understand why until shortly before Lord Hutton reported, when Panorama did a programme about the report, and they put on screen the two newspapers that carried, I think, images of missiles. And I realised at that stage that I'd never seen these newspapers. And again, I couldn't quite understand why, but we checked my diary the next morning, and I had been in Kiev for a couple of days.
So,
I simply hadn't seen these papers, and
you didn't get involved in the issue at the time. The final question on the dossier is this phrase "beyond doubt," which was in the Prime Minister's forward. Did you see the forward? Did you comment on it before?
I certainly saw the draft. I didn't comment on it because, I mean, it did reflect my view of the intelligence and the information that I had been given. I first saw intelligence in relation to Iraq when I went to the Foreign Office in May of 1999. I've actually asked to see some of that intelligence, and it bears out that the assessments were to the effect that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and those assessments continued throughout my time in the Ministry of Defence. I did actually ask to see some of that material just to refresh my memory. There was John Scala writing to David Manning on the 17th of March. The JIC view is clear. Iraq possesses chemical and biological weapons, the means to deliver them, and the capacity to re-establish production. The scale of the holdings is hard to quantify. It is undoubtedly much less than in 1991. Evidence points to a capability that is already militarily significant. There was similarly, the 7th of March, again just before the invasion, a DIS paper saying that Iraq is assessed to possess stocks of chemical and biological agents and the means to deliver them. These pose a direct threat to the UK, United Kingdom and other forces deployed in the Middle East. It went on to say he had stocks of sulfur, mustard and VX, and that he could produce militarily significant quantities of biological agents within days.
Okay,
none of that was qualified.
Okay, well, that's very interesting and relevant to a discussion we'll be having quite soon on our preparations for that. Just finally on this question, as the armed forces went into Iraq, we've already heard from General Fry about a degree of consternation, shall we say, that nothing was being found. When did you begin to suspect that those stocks were not there?
Well, I dare say that I'm prepared to admit I was probably one of the last to concede it, in the sense that I mean, there was, let me be clear, there were stocks of chemical weapons, but those stocks dated from the Iran-Iraq war. And so I began to understand after a period how it could have been that those wanting to pass information back to the United States, to the United Kingdom, might have been relying on those stocks. I mean, some of those shells, for example, were used as improvised explosive devices without any understanding of what was in the shells. Those shells were being used by some of the insurgents in the aftermath of the invasion. As I say, without understanding what they were, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that they were of recent production, but they were there and clearly in store, presumably in barracks and armories that were looted in the immediate aftermath of the invasion.